The Institute for Supply Management's annual conference is fast approaching. On May 6th, thousands of industry professionals will gather in Nashville, Tennessee to network, exchange best practices, and discuss emerging trends. Here at Source One, we're getting ready for the year's premier supply management conference with our new series, ISM2018 Session Insights. Tune in every week to hear our experts discuss the topics that promise to dominate the conversation at this year's conference. Even the most secure and sophisticated supply chains are vulnerable to data breaches. Over the last few years, companies across the globe have learned this lesson the hard way. Retailers, health insurance companies, and even the U.S. government have fallen victim to cyber attacks and face considerable consequences. Torey Guingrich, an IT procurement expert, joins ISM 2018 Session Insights to offer her thoughts on the subject of cybersecurity. The question, she suggests, is not whether a breach will happen, but when. She attests that procurement should not focus on preventative measures alone, but continually work with internal stakeholders to develop response plans. The appropriate preparation could make the difference in mitigating the impact of a breach, avoiding humiliation, and recouping financial losses.
Torey, before we get started, would you mind introducing yourself and giving us a sense of your role at Source One?
Sure. I'm Torey Guingrich. I'm an associate director in our IT and telecom practice. Really, the overarching goal is to help our clients better manage and optimize their IT and telecom budgets.
Cool. So you've written a lot about the consequences of a data breach. Could we start with the basics? Could you describe some of the potential long and short-term consequences of a breach?
Sure. There's a number of different short-term and long-term consequences of a breach, but I think the most obvious one is the financial impact. When you look at the short term, you likely have a period of downtime associated with a breach. So your team's looking to investigate the breach, the breadth and the depth of it, get your systems back up and running. There's also the financial impact associated with those services that you might get from outside vendors. And probably the largest impact being some degree of fines from regulators. We've seen these definitely pick up in the last few years, and more stringent regulations are rolling out. One of the biggest being coming due in May of 2018 with Europe's GDPR, or the General Data Protection Rule. So fines are only going to increase under this new regulation. And the biggest change with that rule coming out is that it applies to any company processing personal data of those that live in the EU, even if the company isn't located there. So likely going to have a pretty big impact on a number of companies that have global consumers. So aside from those kind of shorter term financial impacts, it can also affect your future sales. So looking a little longer term, looking at your reputation, the way you're perceived in a consumer's mind can definitely have a consequence on that trust they have as the consumer organization. And then if you're in the B2B space, a company's perceived risk of working with you can change as these data breaches occur.
And which industries are companies particularly vulnerable to data breaches? And what are some of the risk factors unique to those industries?
Yeah, it's really changed over the years, and the fact is that any company that relies on data, basically everyone, is vulnerable. And we've seen that in the market. Companies that rely and gather a large amount of consumer data, rideshare apps, insurance companies, retailers, credit agencies, and even our own government. The biggest thing these companies have in common is that they have huge databases of consumer data. But at the end of the day, data is so ubiquitous, and there's been a huge growth in monetization of data, which really continues to expand across industries and puts companies or industries at risk that may have never considered those implications.
Could you speak to any recent examples of particularly costly breaches?
Yeah, I don't want to call it a specific one. There have definitely been some costly ones in 2017, but one of the trends we've seen more recently is a long delay in informing the public, or companies trying to keep these breaches under wraps. When they do come out, especially those that have the consumer impact, it really creates distrust. What specifically motivated that delay, I can't say for sure, but I do know that type of delay is something that under new regulation like GDPR, it's only going to increase your financial consequences. That's why I think it's so important to have a data breach response plan in place so that these notifications aren't delayed or handled in some sort of haphazard way that leads to those long delays or non-response to a breach.
So obviously, all companies want to avoid a breach altogether. You've argued in your writing, however, that focusing exclusively on preventative measures can be costly. How can companies take a more proactive approach to developing their response plans, and where should their efforts start?
Sure, and really the biggest reason I say that you can't focus solely on prevention is that it's a constant battle. There are points of vulnerability that companies don't think about or things that are turning into vulnerabilities overnight. So breaches, yes, spend the dollars trying to prevent them and have controls and procedures in place to protect data. But you should also be very prepared for a breach to happen by having that response plan in place. And essentially, a breach response plan is defining what happens when a breach occurs, the different roles of the different players or departments involved, and having a defined and documented strategy to respond. You typically need an advocate for this type of planning in the organization. So this might be risk management or IT, but procurement can certainly be a partner advocate to those groups and take a lead in developing a breach response plan. Considering the vendor management side of things and some of the risks that are introduced with supplier relationships, the different integrations that are involved, procurement is actually quite well aligned to carry the torch for something like this. Efforts really need to start at defining the different roles and responsibilities for when a breach happens and getting everyone on the same page. And ultimately documenting the plan. Everyone may have their own idea in terms of who does what, but if a breach happens, you don't want to be sorting out those different inconsistencies in different people's plans. You want to be acting on a plan that's already been aligned to and agreed to across the different groups so that you can act quickly.
And what sort of suppliers should procurement turn to for assistance as they run into data breaches?
Sure. So the one that most consumers are likely familiar with are the credit monitoring or identity theft repair services. Most of us probably receive these offers for free credit monitoring from the various companies that have experienced a breach. These providers typically provide services around helping you prepare for a breach as well and identifying any gaps that you might have in place. So that's the first and main one that most of us have experience with. The other, probably lesser known types of vendors are forensic IT firms and outside legal support. So forensic IT is brought in to really be the detectives of the breach. If you think about the IT people in your organization, they know your systems, they can manage them on a day-to-day basis, but they likely don't have kind of the niche investigative skills or the time to really determine the full scope of a breach. Very similarly, with outside counsel, you likely need to bring in specialists who are qualified to look at the compliance and regulatory requirements for reporting and wading through the various requirements after a breach.
I would assume leveraging preventative services means paying a retainer fee. How can a company mitigate risk if they can or won't retain services? And what might some of the drawbacks be of that more reactive approach to handling data breaches?
Sure. By foregoing a retainer model, you might end up paying higher rates in the long run, or when a breach occurs, you may be somewhat constrained on vendor choice and those response timeframes from the vendor if you're working to get a vendor in place really quickly. But a retainer model isn't the only option. The biggest step that procurement can take is to do essentially pre-qualification of vendors. So knowing who would you go to, understanding the costs of retainer versus the as-needed model, defining a priority list of suppliers, getting them in place as approved vendors and whatever other procurement requirements are in place. That's really going to allow you to ramp up quickly if you are using that kind of as-needed model. They're very unlikely to turn down your business, but getting those suppliers onboarded might delay your public response, your IT investigation and root cause analysis, or other critical pieces of your response plan. So it's a give and take, and I think every company needs to look at their risk and what makes sense for their individual company and the level of risk willing to take on.
And what else can companies do to optimize their internal breach response teams? What different roles should all the departments play? And how can procurement in particular help with these breach response efforts?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of players. Procurement's role is really to bring together the right groups. We do that all the time with stakeholders and suppliers. Internal teams really are no different. So procurement can act almost as an internal project manager. They can make sure that the different priorities are heard and addressed within the response plan, and that they're addressed at the right level of priority for the organization. Really act as that quarterback for the initiative while also vetting and onboarding the necessary vendor partners as needed. Just some of the groups to involve would certainly be IT. They play a big part. They need to close off the point of breach and work with your forensic IT suppliers. Legal would be involved, looking at the compliance and regulatory impacts, again, working with that outside counsel to determine the degree of reporting required. Your marketing and communications team, they're really going to lead the response to the breach. They're going to develop key materials like call center scripts, press releases. They won't need to develop these up front, but they are going to determine what needs to be developed, tailor it to the specific breach, and really get a spokesperson in place to have the right consistent message out to the public and to their customers. Another big one would be operations. So when a breach hits, call centers very quickly become overloaded. So operations has to figure out what's the communication within those call center scripts for your in-house and any outsourced call centers. They need to figure out how internal operations might need to be adjusted. What are you communicating out to your employees and planning for, if someone calls an employee, how should they respond about the breach, or who should they direct that